My golden child brother stole my truck, wrecked it, and got arrested. Now my parents blame me. But I did this instead. Growing up with Parker as my older brother was a masterclass in learning how to be invisible. He was only a year older, but that single year seemed to grant him unending privileges. While I was left to clean up messes or face the consequences of my own minor mistakes, Parker floated through life shielded by my parents' unwavering support. He was their golden boy, the chosen one who could do no wrong. And even when he did wrong, it was either swept under the rug or blamed on someone else, usually me. The favoritism started early and became glaringly obvious as we got older. Parker had an uncanny ability to take whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, without a second thought. My toys, my clothes, my savings, it was all fair game to him. It wasn't just about what he took, but the complete lack of accountability that followed. If he broke something, it was dismissed as an accident. If he took money from me, it was rationalized as something I should have been happy to share. Meanwhile, any boundary I tried to set was treated as unreasonable. One memory stands out so vividly that I can still feel the sting of it, even years later. When I was 10, I spent an entire summer saving up for something I desperately wanted, a remote-controlled car. It wasn't just any RC car, either. It was the one I had seen in the store window for months. Bright red with sleek detailing, headlights that actually worked, and wheels that could handle any terrain. It was the stuff of dreams for a kid like me. After mowing lawns and doing every odd job I could find, I finally had enough money to buy it. That moment when I walked out of the store, clutching the box, was one of the happiest of my life. The car wasn't just a toy, it was a symbol of my hard work paying off. I couldn't wait to get it home and try it out, but as soon as Parker saw it, his eyes lit up with that familiar gleam of entitlement. He didn't even bother asking if he could have a turn, he simply demanded it. I hesitated, knowing full well how reckless he could be, but my resolve crumbled under the weight of trying to be the good sibling. Within minutes of taking control, Parker was racing the car around the driveway with wild abandon. His reckless joy was evident in the way he pushed the limits, as if testing how quickly he could break it. It didn't take long for disaster to strike. The car slammed into the curb at full speed, the impact so jarring it made me wince. I ran to pick it up, hoping against hope that it wasn't as bad as it looked, but my worst fears were confirmed. The front wheel was snapped off, the once pristine body was scratched and dented, and the car was rendered completely useless. Parker didn't seem the least bit bothered by what he had done. His indifference was a slap in the face, a reminder that he never had to care about the consequences of his actions. When I took the broken car to my parents, clutching it in my hands with tears streaming down my face, I was met with the same dismissive attitude I'd come to expect. My mom barely looked up from her magazine before brushing off the entire incident as though it were insignificant. She didn't scold Parker or offer to replace the car. Instead, she told me I was overreacting and that it was just a toy. That moment crystallized what I had always known deep down. Parker could do whatever he wanted, and I would always be expected to let it go. As we grew older, Parker's entitlement expanded to encompass just about everything I owned or cared about. It wasn't just toys anymore. He took my clothes without asking, leaving them stretched out or stained beyond repair. He borrowed my bike, a second-hand Schwinn I had worked all summer to afford, and abandoned it in a ditch, where it rusted in the rain. When I finally found it, the tires were flat, the frame was scratched, and it was completely unusable. My parents' response to this was the same as always, a sigh of exasperation directed at me for making a fuss, and a lecture about the importance of sharing. By the time I was a teenager, I had stopped expecting any fairness or support from my parents. My efforts to stand up for myself were always met with frustration or outright dismissal, and I was constantly reminded that Parker was just being Parker. The double standard was suffocating. While Parker breezed through life without ever facing the consequences of his actions, I was held to an impossibly high standard. If I so much as asked for help with gas money, I was given a lecture about the value of hard work, even though I was already juggling multiple part-time jobs to make ends meet. The breaking point came when I was 18. After years of silently enduring Parker's antics and my parents' enabling behavior, I finally snapped. The catalyst was my laptop, a modest but essential device that I relied on for school and college applications. One evening, I came home to find it shattered. The screen was cracked, the keyboard was mangled, and it was clear that it was beyond repair. I didn't even need to ask who was responsible. The evidence was overwhelming. Parker had taken it without permission and destroyed it, just as he had done with so many of my other belongings. That was the moment I realized I couldn't stay in that house any longer. The years of frustration, resentment, and feeling like I didn't matter boiled over, and I decided to take control of my own life. I called my Uncle Hank, a no-nonsense former cop who had always been a voice of reason in my life, and explained everything. Without hesitation, he told me to pack my bags and come stay with him. It was the first real step I had taken toward reclaiming my independence, and though it wasn't easy, it was a decision that changed everything. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight of freedom in my hands. That old Silverado was more than just a truck to me. It was my escape, my independence. I used it to get to my new job at a hardware store on the edge of town, where I spent my days stocking shelves and helping customers load lumber, tools, and other heavy items into their vehicles. The Silverado quickly became more than just a way to get around. It became a tool, a partner in my newfound self-sufficiency. It wasn't long before I started taking on side jobs, using the truck to haul junk to the dump, help neighbors move, and even deliver furniture. Every dollar I earned felt like a small victory, proof that I didn't need anyone to bail me out. Not my parents, not Parker, not anyone. Of course, Parker couldn't stand that. The first time I drove the Silverado over to my parents' house, it didn't even take him 10 seconds to start scrutinizing it like it was a personal affront to him. He stood there in the driveway, arms crossed, narrowing his eyes as though he was trying to burn a hole through the truck with his glare. His posture alone was enough to let me know he was going to start something, and as expected, he was immediately consumed by the unfairness of it all. But Parker's envy wasn't just about the truck itself. It was about what it symbolized. To him, it was proof that I had something he didn't, that I was building a life on my terms while he stayed stuck in the same cycle of entitlement and failure. What he didn't realize, or maybe refused to accept, was that the truck wasn't a gift handed to me without effort. It represented countless hours of work, careful planning, and the sheer determination to break free from the chaos he always seemed to bring into my life. A few months later, Parker wrecked yet another car. It was his third, an old Pontiac Grand Am that my dad had bought for him after his last disaster. The details of the accident were all too predictable. Driving too fast on a rainy day, losing control, and smashing headlong into a street pole. When I heard about it, I felt a brief flicker of sympathy, not for Parker, but for the car. It didn't deserve to meet its end like that. What came next, though, replaced that flicker with a surge of anger I couldn't ignore. It started with a phone call from my mom. Her tone was casual, but I could tell from the hesitation in her voice that she was building up to a favor I wouldn't want to grant. She explained that Parker was in a bind, without a car, and struggling to get to work. It didn't take a genius to figure out where she was going with this. When she finally suggested that I let Parker borrow the Silverado, just until he gets back on his feet, I didn't even hesitate before refusing. The conversation went downhill from there. My mom tried every angle she could think of, from guilt trips about family helping family to suggesting that I could just take the bus for a while. I stood firm, knowing that giving Parker access to the truck was a surefire way to lose it forever. For the next week, my parents treated me like a pariah. My mom muttered under her breath every time I stopped by their house, while Parker sulked like a child denied a toy. None of it mattered to me. The Silverado was my lifeline, and I wasn't going to let him destroy it the way he had everything else. But Parker was nothing if not persistent. To him, a refusal wasn't an answer. It was a challenge. A few days later, he proved just how far he was willing to go to get what he wanted. It was a Friday evening, and I had just finished a grueling shift at the hardware store. As I walked into the parking lot, I felt the exhaustion of the day settle over me like a weight. But when I reached the spot where I always parked the Silverado, that exhaustion turned into confusion. The truck wasn't there. At first, I thought I must have been mistaken. Maybe I had parked it in a different row or spot without realizing it. I walked the entire lot twice, scanning every corner, but the truth sank in like a stone in my gut. The truck was gone. My heart raced as I pulled out my phone, my hands trembling with a mix of fury and disbelief. There was only one person who would do this, and I didn't need confirmation to know I was right. When I called Parker, his tone was infuriatingly casual, as though this was all just a minor misunderstanding. He didn't even try to deny it. He had taken the truck, stolen it really, and acted as if I was the one overreacting. He hung up on me before I could even begin to process what had just happened. My blood boiled as the pieces started to fall into place. Parker had gone out of his way to make a spare key for the Silverado, exploiting a vulnerability in the model I'd read about online. It wasn't enough for him to ask. He had to take. That was Parker's way, and I had reached my breaking point. I paced back and forth in the empty parking lot, my anger building with every passing second. The nerve, the sheer audacity of Parker stealing my truck and treating it like his personal plaything sent my blood boiling. Nearly half an hour later, I heard the familiar rumble of the Silverado's engine as it pulled into the lot. My stomach churned at the sight of it. Mud coated the sides like a second skin, and through the windshield, I could see fast food wrappers littering the passenger seat. The faint smell of cigarettes hit me before Parker even stepped out of the truck. It wasn't just a vehicle anymore, it looked like a crime scene. Parker climbed out, wearing that same smug grin he always wore when he thought he had won. Without a word, he tossed me the keys, acting like he was doing me a favor. To him, it was no big deal, just another instance of Parker getting what Parker wanted. My hands clenched into fists as I caught the keys, my mind racing through a dozen different things I wanted to say, or do. Instead, I glared at him, my jaw tight as I bit back the urge to lash out. The truck was a disaster. Inside, the cup holders were stuffed with crumpled wrappers, the seats were stained with sticky soda residue, and the overpowering stench of stale cigarettes clung to everything. Parker didn't even smoke, which meant he'd let one of his low-life friends trash my cab while he played chauffeur. It wasn't just disrespectful, it was personal. This truck wasn't just some beat-up vehicle. It was mine, a symbol of everything I had worked for. And Parker, as always, treated it like it was his to destroy. Driving back to Uncle Hank's house that night was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel as I fought to keep my anger in check. Every mile was a battle against the overwhelming frustration and helplessness that swirled inside me. By the time I pulled into Hank's driveway, my rage had turned into something colder, heavier, a simmering bitterness that I couldn't shake. Hank was in the garage, hunched over his motorcycle with tools spread out around him. The smell of oil and grease filled the air, a sharp contrast to the chaos Parker had left behind in my truck. When he looked up and saw me standing there, my face must have said it all. Without a word, he set down his wrench and waited for me to speak. I told him everything. How Parker had made a spare key, stolen the truck, trashed it, and acted like it was no big deal. Hank listened in silence, his jaw tightening as I described the mess inside and the violation I felt. When I finished, he straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't have to say much to get his point across. "Nathan," he said firmly, "you need to protect yourself. Parker's never going to learn until someone forces him to." Hank offered to help me install a GPS tracker in the truck the next morning, just in case. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd need, but given Parker's track record, it felt like a necessary precaution. That night, I spent hours cleaning out the truck. I scrubbed the seats until my arms ached, sprayed enough air freshener to mask the cigarette smell, and still felt like it wasn't enough. No matter how much I cleaned, there were stains I couldn't erase, mud caked under the pedals, soda spills that had seeped too deep into the fabric. The truck felt tainted, a constant reminder of how easily Parker could waltz into my life and leave chaos in his wake. For a while, things went quiet. Parker avoided me, probably to dodge another confrontation, and my parents gave me the cold shoulder, as they always did whenever I stood up to their golden child. It didn't bother me much. I had my truck back, I was working more shifts at the hardware store, and for once, it felt like my life was my own. But of course, it didn't last. Christmas came around, and with it, the annual family gathering at my parents' house. I didn't look forward to it, but I still went, not for my parents or Parker, but for Uncle Hank and a few cousins I actually got along with. I parked the Silverado neatly at the end of the driveway, far from the chaos of the house, where I could keep an eye on it. The moment I stepped inside, my mom greeted me with her usual passive-aggressive flair. Her smile was stretched too tight to be genuine, and her tone dripped with sarcasm. I brushed it off, heading straight for the kitchen, where Uncle Hank was nursing a mug of coffee. He gave me a knowing look and patted me on the shoulder. "Ignore her," he said simply, and I nodded. It was all I could do. The day dragged on, as these gatherings always did. My mom couldn't resist making snide comments about how protective I was of the truck, while Parker sulked in the corner, glued to his phone. By the time evening rolled around, I was more than ready to leave. But then I noticed something, a small, sinking realization that hit me like a punch to the gut. My truck keys, which were always clipped securely to my belt loop, were gone. Panic set in as I retraced my steps through the house, searching every room. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Rushing to the front window, I looked out at the driveway. The Silverado was gone. My heart sank as I pulled out my phone and opened the GPS tracker app. The dot representing my truck was already miles away, moving fast. Without hesitation, I called Parker. When he answered, his casual tone only fueled my rage. He didn't even try to deny it. "Relax," he said, as though stealing my truck was no big deal. I hung up on him before he could finish, my hands shaking with anger. Storming back into the house, I found Uncle Hank and told him what had happened. His jaw tightened, but he didn't say a word. Instead, he grabbed his keys and we headed for his car. I stared at the GPS app on my phone, watching the dot slow down and stop near an exit ramp off the highway. When we approached the scene, my stomach turned at the sight. There it was, my Silverado, nose deep in a snowbank on the side of the road. The front bumper was crumpled, the left headlight shattered into a jagged mess, and the grille looked like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it. Standing off to the side, Parker leaned against the guardrail, his arms crossed, and his expression a mix of defiance and inconvenience. To him, this was just another minor setback, nothing worth getting worked up about. I stepped out of Uncle Hank's car, my boots crunching on the frozen gravel, and let my eyes drift over the wreckage. My chest felt tight, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Parker, true to form, shrugged it off with a defensive comment about icy roads and how it wasn't his fault. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my voice steady as I demanded to know what the hell he had been thinking. But before he could conjure up another excuse, a police cruiser rolled up behind us, its lights cutting through the snowy darkness. The silence that followed was suffocating. The officer climbed out, his boots crunching against the ice as he approached, his expression calm but firm. Parker shifted uneasily, the smugness that had been plastered across his face now replaced with a faint nervousness. As the officer surveyed the scene, the Silverado buried in snow, the damage plain as day, he asked what was going on. I didn't hesitate. My words came out sharp and steady as I told him the truth. Parker had stolen my truck, wrecked it, and I had the GPS logs to prove it. The officer turned to Parker, his gaze unreadable. When he asked if what I said was true, Parker stammered, fumbling for defense. His face turned red as he tried to explain it away as borrowing, claiming it wasn't theft because I was his brother. But the officer wasn't buying it. He pressed further, asking if Parker had permission, and the slight hesitation before his answer was all the confirmation anyone needed. "That's called theft," the officer said bluntly. Parker immediately launched into his next excuse. The roads were icy. It wasn't his fault. He didn't mean for any of this to happen. But Uncle Hank, who had been standing back, silent until now, took a step forward. His voice was calm but cold as he suggested the officer check if Parker had been driving sober. The shift in Parker's posture was subtle but telling. His eyes darted toward the officer for the briefest moment, his composure cracking. The officer nodded and led Parker to the cruiser for a breathalyzer test. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. I stood there, watching as the officer went through the motions. Parker's stumbling excuses grew weaker with every step, and when the results came back, the officer's face hardened. The words that followed were almost a relief. Parker was under arrest for driving under the influence and operating on a suspended license. I watched as the officer cuffed him and guided him toward the cruiser. Parker's bravado evaporated completely, replaced by panic and desperation. He shouted over his shoulder, his voice laced with anger and fear, that our parents were going to kill me for this. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Parker had made his choices, and for once, he was facing the consequences. A few minutes later, my parents' van screeched to a halt behind the police cruiser. My mom practically flung herself out of the passenger seat, her coat whipping in the freezing wind as she ran toward us. My dad followed, slower but no less frantic. The moment my mom saw Parker being loaded into the cruiser, she turned to me, her face a storm of anger and disbelief. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice shrill and accusatory.
Ich zerrte her, incredulous.
What did I do? I shot back. Parker stole my truck. He wrecked it. He's been drinking. He did this to himself. The officer stepped in, his tone firm but professional, as he explained the charges and why this wasn't something that could be ignored. My mom, however, wasn't interested in hearing reason. Her voice wavered as she insisted it was all a misunderstanding, calling Parker a good kid who had just made a mistake. Uncle Hank, standing beside me with his arms crossed, snorted at her defense. His dry comment about how many times we'd heard that excuse before earned him a sharp glare from my mom, who snapped that this was a family matter and didn't require police involvement. Hank didn't back down. His voice was calm but unyielding as he pointed out that it stopped being a family matter the moment Parker endangered lives by stealing a vehicle and driving drunk. My dad, ever the peacemaker, stepped in, urging everyone to calm down and insisting that this could be sorted out. His words only made me angrier. "You're not sorting anything out," I said, my voice rising. "He stole from me. He trashed my truck. He's getting exactly what he deserves." My mom's tears began to flow as she accused me of betraying my brother, of making things worse. "You didn't have to call the police," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't call the cops," I snapped. "The GPS tracker led me here, and someone else called it in. But I should have called them the first time he took it." The officer interrupted before things could spiral further, explaining that Parker would be taken to the station and that my parents could sort out bail later. As the cruiser pulled away, Parker glaring at me from the back seat, my mom turned to me with an expression I'll never forget, a twisted combination of anger, disappointment, and disbelief. "How could you let this happen to your brother?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "You're kidding, right? He did this to himself." My dad sighed, shaking his head like I was the one being unreasonable. "You could have handled this privately, Nathan. You didn't need to make a scene." "Privately?" I repeated, almost laughing. "You mean let him get away with it again?"
No.
"Not this time." Hank placed a hand on my shoulder, stepping between me and my parents. "Let's go, Nathan. You don't need to stand here and justify yourself." Without another word, we turned and walked back to Hank's car. I didn't look back. The fallout started the very next day. My mom left a voicemail before I was even awake, her voice thick with tears and guilt trips, begging me to fix things. She blamed me for letting Parker sit in jail, insisting he'd been through enough. I deleted the message without responding. Uncle Hank, on the other hand, looked almost proud when I told him about it. "Good," he said simply. "Maybe this will finally teach Parker that actions have consequences." That afternoon, my phone rang again. This time it was Parker calling from the county jail. I let it ring a few times before answering, curious about what he had to say. His voice trembled just enough to sound pitiful as he apologized and begged me to bail him out. I listened in silence, waiting for him to finish. When he was done, I said one word. "No." He pleaded, his voice growing louder and more desperate, but I didn't waver. "You should have thought about that before you stole my truck," I said coldly. When he shouted that I couldn't leave him there, that I was his brother, I hung up without another word. A few minutes later, my mom called again. When my mom called again, I answered, mostly out of curiosity to see how far she would go. Her voice, a mix of desperation and anger, immediately filled the line. She insisted that Tyler needed me, that he was in a terrible place, and that they didn't have the money to bail him out. Her words carried an edge, as though she believed it was my responsibility to fix the situation. I listened for a moment, then cut her off. Tyler had stolen my truck, wrecked it, and landed himself in jail. None of that was on me, and I told her as much. Her voice rose with frustration, accusing me of tearing the family apart. I stayed calm, though, and told her what I knew to be true. Tyler had done that himself, with their help. For years, they had enabled him, and I was done being a part of the mess. After hanging up, I blocked her number. For the first time in years, my phone was silent. No calls, no messages, no guilt-laden pleas to clean up Tyler's latest disaster. The silence was eerie at first, almost unfamiliar, but it quickly became liberating. I kept my phone quiet, ignoring unknown numbers, because I already knew who they were. My parents, and likely Tyler too, were desperate to pull me back into the chaos, but I refused to go back. For so many years, I had played their game, bending under the weight of guilt and brushing off the endless blame. Not anymore. Cutting them off felt like shedding a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. The fallout wasn't far behind. About a week after Tyler's arrest, I was in Uncle Hank's garage, helping him replace the spark plugs on his motorcycle. The faint hum of the radio played in the background as Hank handed me a wrench, his hands covered in grease. He asked casually if I'd heard anything from my parents, though I suspected he already knew the answer. I told him about my decision to block their numbers and the guilt trip my mom had tried to lay on me. Hank chuckled dryly, shaking his head as he muttered about how typical it was of her to blame anyone but herself. He asked if I was sure I could hold the line, knowing full well how relentless they could be. I didn't hesitate when I said yes. Hank didn't press the issue. That was something I appreciated about him. He gave advice when it was needed, but never pushed too hard. He trusted me to make my own decisions and respected them once I did. Later that night, a knock at the door shattered the quiet. It wasn't the kind of polite knock from a neighbor stopping by. It was loud, impatient, and demanding. My stomach twisted as I walked to the door, already knowing who it would be. Standing on the porch in the freezing cold were my parents. My mom's coat was pulled tight around her, her eyes sharp and unyielding, while my dad stood behind her, looking tired and uncomfortable. My mom started speaking the moment I opened the door, her tone clipped and accusatory. She insisted we needed to talk, but I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe, making it clear there was nothing to discuss. Her voice grew sharper as she accused me of abandoning my brother and making things worse. She said this wasn't how family treated one another, as though I needed a lecture on the concept of family. I let her words wash over me, unmoved, until she softened her tone, trying a different tactic. She spoke of Tyler's struggles, of how he needed support, and how I was supposed to be there for him. But I wasn't swayed. For years, I had watched them coddle him, enabling his selfishness, while expecting me to shoulder the blame for his failures. I had supported him my entire life, but that time was over. My dad eventually stepped in, trying to calm things down with his usual measured tone. He painted Tyler's actions as simple mistakes and insisted they were just trying to help him get back on his feet. I couldn't hold back a bitter laugh. Tyler's so-called mistakes had left a trail of destruction in their wake, and yet they refused to let him face the consequences. They wanted me to hand over my life, my peace, and my hard-earned stability to fix his mess once again. But I stood firm, telling them I was done with their endless cycle of excuses. My mom's frustration boiled over. She accused me of being unreasonable, of thinking I was better than the rest of the family. I stayed calm, pointing out that I had owned up to every mistake I'd ever made, unlike Tyler, who expected everyone else to clean up after him. She tried one last angle, claiming I couldn't understand because I wasn't a parent. She said it was impossible to watch a child in trouble and not want to fix it. But I refused to let her guilt me. I told her I would raise my children to take responsibility for their actions and not walk over others. Then my dad made one final plea. He asked if I would at least let Tyler stay with me for a while, saying he had nowhere else to go. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. After everything Tyler had done, they still believed I should take him in, as if I owed him that much. I didn't even entertain the idea. I told them no and made it clear that I wasn't going to be part of their enabling any longer. My mom looked like she might cry, while my dad just seemed exhausted, but I didn't feel sorry for them. Without another word, I stepped back inside and closed the door. For a long time, I stood in the silence, my heart pounding. I didn't feel triumphant, but I didn't feel guilty either. I felt done. The next morning, I woke up to a long voicemail from my mom, but I deleted it without listening. The texts followed, angry, desperate, full of guilt trips, but I ignored them all. Tyler stayed in jail for a while longer until my parents scraped together enough money to bail him out, dipping into their retirement fund and borrowing from relatives. When I heard about it from Hank, I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Tyler went straight back to their house after his release. He sulked like a scolded child, muttering about how unfair everything was. I stopped by once to grab a box of old tools from the garage. As I passed through the living room, he didn't even look up from the couch. He sat there, staring at the floor, radiating self-pity. There was nothing left to say to him. In the months that followed, Tyler's life continued to spiral. Without a license, he couldn't afford the fines to get it reinstated, and he struggled to hold down a job. My parents, true to form, gave him everything they could, money, excuses, and endless second chances, but it was never enough. One afternoon, Hank and I were sitting on the back porch, drinking coffee, when Tyler pulled up in my parents' old minivan. He had taken a job as a pizza delivery driver, and the look on his face when he saw us was priceless. Hank gave him a small wave and told him to keep it up. Tyler muttered something under his breath and hurried back to the van, clearly embarrassed. For the first time in his life, he was being humbled. But even as he stumbled through his failures, my parents still refused to see him for who he really was. The calls from them still came, but I deleted every voicemail without listening. My mom's voice felt like a ghost from a life I had finally left behind, echoing the same refrain. "Nathan, you're breaking this family apart." But I wasn't breaking the family apart. I was finally putting myself back together.